Sorry, in case you're confused, I'm also confused. I forgot what was my talk title when I was preparing the talk, so I just threw in some buzzwords and like a cool slide, so you can look up the talk title in the agenda, I think. I'm surprised there are people because the sun is shining. You just had lunch. What are you doing here? I mean, no, don't get me wrong. There's a bunch of nice, interesting talks at the same time. Actually, I want to go to the talk in the Agile stage at 2:30, so we have to hurry up. But you're here, and that's great. What is not so great is the introduction of this talk, because I mean, I usually speak in front of only Ruby people, Ruby, the programming language, and I usually have photos from the last conference or from the pre-party, from the warm-up party of people drunk, and then I have those photos and I don't know, I make fun of people and everyone is laughing. Here I don't know anyone, so I had this really retarded idea to start with an About Me slide, and I have not had an About Me slide in many years because I don't know. I mean, there were a couple of really nice About Me slides already in these conference talks. When I do it, for me, it feels like I'm doing product placement for myself. And honestly, when I started with my name, I mean, this is not my name. This is my name. I don't know. It's nothing special. And that's actually my name, so there's no middle name or not a cool story why people call me Nick or something like that. It's just a very simple name. And usually when I'm at conferences, people have those cool characters like in Poland or here in Czech Republic, and then you hear, oh, that's how you pronounce your name. That's really cool, actually. My name is super boring. I mean, it was pronounced correctly without any pre-education. And yeah, I mean, it's ASCII compliant, so I don't know how you guys do that when you have a US immigration or something. How do you get through with that with your S with the hook and the R with the, I don't know, this corner thing, and how do you do that? Because it sounds like a nightmare when you're not ASCII compliant, but apparently it works with UTF-8. Also, this is actually there's no Nicholas or something. Nick. My parents they're really funny, and I love them for giving me a short and concise name. As I said, it's nothing special, but I do love my parents for the way they named all their kids. So we have 5 kids, and they all have 4-character names starting with an N. Except for my youngest sister, she was supposed to be Nena, and then there's this stupid singer from Germany, 99 red balloons. So they decided to call her Lena. But that's pretty cool. So we never have problems when we call someone and you spell your name. It's short, concise, but it's actually nothing special. So yeah, I mean, yeah. Then the next thing that is always on an About Me slide is the the professional LinkedIn mugshot, and I don't know, people doing the thoughtful guy or the aggressive guy or Martin the pointing finger gun. I don't have any photo like that. There's only photos of me, I don't know, laughing and looking retarded and being drunk or something like that. So I don't have the LinkedIn profile shot, and that's, I don't know. I could already tell this slide is going downhill because, I don't know, so far, yeah, it looks reasonable. My biography is an absolute disaster. So I wouldn't even know what to put there to impress you, because normally people have this I was born in, I don't know, Yorkshire, and then I studied in Yale, and after that I did my doctor in, I don't know, UCLA or something like that, and I became product manager at whatever. My life is totally fine. I have everything under control. But my biography is a nightmare. As an example, I studied computer science and I studied political science. Political science was awesome because you learned something. Computer science was fucking shit because we only learned how to prove the hoax theorem in a polymorphic, I don't know, injection or something like that. I have no idea why we learned that, but apparently it's important if you want to be a computer scientist. I studied for 9 years because I was always working as a software consultant. And the funniest part was that I didn't even know that I'm kind of finished with university because I was still like enrolled, and suddenly my uni calls me, hey, you actually passed all your classes. Where's your bachelor thesis? And I didn't even know that I'm already at this stage where you have all the classes. So that's like how messy my biography is. Yeah, whatever. Like maybe the fact that I was in Czech Republic in high school is important. And the only thing I remember is that we smuggled this box of Kruzovice. Is that how you pronounce it? Kruzovice? And we got it into the hotel, and we were drinking there, you know, like badass 16-year-old punk rockers. Yeah, 1 beer per person. And then the elevator opens, and our teachers step out like, hey guys, we are all like looking at each other. What are we doing now? And they're like, we saw you coming in with a case of beer. Can we have 2 bottles? So that's when I realized my math teacher is a human being. So I don't know, maybe that should go in my biography. But speaking of teachers and positions, I love job descriptions. I'm struggling with mine because, I don't know, I can be the senior architect if you want. I can be the junior developer. I can also be the head of engineering. It's all great words. And when I really realized this slide is an absolute train wreck is with the company. Because do you know that when people have a conference talk, and they have this about me slide, and then they have this like Microsoft, or they're working for, I don't know, Apple or something, or Google. First people are leaving. Hey, we have 50 minutes, so I have time to kill. And when people have those big badass companies, I always feel automatically impressed. Like I think like, oh, they must be badass programmers or something, or product managers, because they have this like Apple backing them. I don't have that either. So yeah, I work for an open source project. It's called Trailblazer, and as I already said, I could be, if you want, I could even be CEO of that company, because it's my company. Yeah, no one is impressed. People are yawning. Oh, I was not expecting that. You're alive, that's great. So yeah, basically I've been working on this open source project called Trailblazer, and obviously it's in the Ruby language, as you could see. And I want to show some aspects of Trailblazer. Actually, I'm going to tell a lot about the history of Trailblazer and how we got there, because it's a 50 minutes talk, and we can make it 45. But I'm not going to show a lot of like badass code, because I really do not enjoy presenting code. I love watching code, but I don't like presenting it. So Trailblazer is on GitHub. It's like a framework. It actually consists of like, I don't know, 50 different, we call them gems. So that's a library in Ruby. And this is really when I switch between sublimes in my laptop, this is what it looks like. And it's a nightmare, really. It is a nightmare. So Trailblazer is not this one product. It's an umbrella framework with lots of small parts, and you know every part is important, but it's a lot of work, and it's open source. That means no one pays for it. This is why I cannot afford sleeves, by the way. As I already said, so this is me trying to draw with my mouse. It's actually supposed to be like a Ruby, but I think it's really nice. Trailblazer is written in the Ruby programming language. It's actually not, so the concepts we're going to explore today, come in, don't be shy. The concepts are really abstract, so you could implement that in any programming language, JavaScript, or in like real programming languages. Because, I don't know, so I'm stuck with Ruby. And I had a few chats with attendees already and with speakers. Not that there is a difference. And everyone starts smiling when I mention I work in Ruby. And that is because sometimes I feel like the Ruby programming language is a fucking joke. Because I mean, I work in Ruby for 20 years, and I'm too lazy to learn something new, or maybe I'm too scared or intimidated, because I mean, I know a lot of people there. I know how to build gems, libraries. I know how the release cycles. I know a lot of people. I know how to poke someone to, I don't know, like write a post about a new release or something like that. But I'm not overly happy with the Ruby programming language, because it has not changed in 20 years. So literally nothing has changed in this language. And it's super, super, super insecure. Not in terms of like memory leaks or something, more in terms of you have to use a lot of discipline to write code that works. And because it's always this like, oh, Ruby is so beautiful. It's just English, and you write something, and you pass something into a method, and it just works. And then everything breaks like all the time at runtime in production because the language has no boundaries designed or anything. And if you think I'm talking only to get sympathy from people who don't like Ruby, I actually gave talks like Ruby is dead years ago. So that's why people don't like me in the Ruby community, and this is why I have to come here. No, joking. But so, for example, in this talk, I was showing how Ruby compares to Java, to PHP, and I think those were the two languages. And if you mention those languages in a Ruby environment, people will smack you in the face. They're like, what the fuck are you mentioning Java? Java sucks. Like, no, it does not, because Java actually has a lot of progress on the abstraction level, on the language level. Ruby, which we're still like super primitive. I mean, we have like, arrays, and arrays have like 582 methods. And then people learn all those methods. For what? Because it's not going to make your code architecture better. And we don't have any tools for architecture in Ruby. And a lot of other languages that the Ruby hipsters laugh about, JavaScript, come on. Like, there's a lot of progress, and I really have a lot of, respect for that. And sometimes I wonder, what am I doing in Ruby? Is there anything wrong? My timer is running, no worries. As a professional speaker, I brought my own presenter stick, and it's actually working, as you can tell. Ruby is the programming language, and there's this big monolithic framework called Ruby on Rails. It's the new logo, it's great. I probably have to pay licensing fees to the inventor because he's like super strict about licensing and everything. We are still talking about open source here, by the way. And I don't know, has anyone not heard of Ruby on Rails? Don't be shy. Come on, you're lying. Like, you all know Ruby on Rails. That's great. I thought I'm speaking to an audience that has taste. So Ruby on Rails is basically a very, complete framework. It covers every aspect of a web application, but it has this ridiculously primitive architecture. So they call it MVC, Model View Controller, and they are incredibly proud of this architecture. So the way it works, I just want to show you. Okay, you were right about the contrast, it looks shitty, but just to give you a brief example how Ruby on Rails works on a very, very generic code level. So, for example, you have a block, and the cool examples, they're always about building a block in 5 minutes. That's kind of the Ruby on Rails selling point. So you have a block, you write some bullshit, and then you click on create or publish. And what happens in a Rails environment is, so the browser will send a post request to a certain URL, and in the post request there will be like the submitted form. I just draw this cloud. It looks pretty cool, I think. And then this request is intercepted by a controller. So that's kind of the endpoint concept in Ruby on Rails. And the controller has a method, and that method maps basically to that URL that is being submitted. And then in that method, we call that a controller action. You kind of process whatever you have to do with the incoming data and do whatever you need to do. So the business logic is usually sitting in that method. And the controller can also render a response, and you can use like template engines. So when I say render show, it'll grab some template file and interpolate the variables and so on. So basically, that's kind of how Ruby on Rails works in a nutshell. So if my talk was only about Ruby on Rails, we could all go now to the bar. But unfortunately, this sucks. So as I said, we have this concept of MVC. So that's what people think is the answer to code design. And that's also reflected in the way Ruby on Rails has the file structures their project. So you have this app directory, and then you have a directory for controllers, you have a directory for models, and you have a directory for views. And in those files, in those directories, you have files that map to specific domain objects. Usually they map directly to database tables, like user or posting in a blog blog posting. So that's how they structure their files. Sometimes they have an additional directory. If you're really fancy, they have services. And in those service objects, they might have additional code that you need in order to, I don't know, create or update a blog post or something like that. But that's kind of what they call MVC. That's their architecture. So all the code you need to create a blog post, all the code you need to update a blog post, is distributed over 3 layers, basically, or maybe actually 2 layers, because the view layer is only rendering. And that's how they organize their code. And we get to that in a second. And they're really, really proud of this architecture. It's so simple. Oh, God, it's just like 3 layers. They even have videos where they make fun of other... Actually, the videos are really funny, I have to say. And they're also well-produced and cool. But they're making fun of other frameworks like Java, I don't know, Spring or something, and, Symfony and PHP, where they make fun. You have so many abstraction layers. We only have 3. It's much easier. And it's kind of... The problem is, look at this is my favorite. If you look for MVC in Rails, you get like 1 million diagrams, and they're completely pointless. It's like, look at them. They're complete bullshit. And this is my favorite one. Actually, I didn't even realize that one of my libraries is in the diagram. But so that's kind of how people architect, in best case, their Rails application. So usually there are no services. So all the code sits in controllers. And as you can see, most of the code is in the model. So the model is basically your connection to the database. So that's the code that you use to talk to your database. And that's also the place where people push all the business code. So that's kind of the typical thing in Rails, is that, I don't know, I think they call it fat model, skinny controller. So basically all the business code is supposed to be in the model, which is a really, really big problem, because the model will grow. And it's absolutely a disaster. After 3 weeks of following the Rails way, you are in a coding hell, really, because all the code that should be nicely structured is in one place. I'm going to show some examples later. And they are still proud of that. So it's like, hey, we are so simple. Ruby on Rails is like this shit. If you want to write an app, you can do it in 10 minutes. And it drives me nuts for like 20 years. But that's my problem. So instead of going nuts, I decided, hey, I don't like the way code is architected in Rails. So let's extend Rails. In my younger years, I wanted to replace Rails, which is not so cool idea because Rails has a huge market. And actually, I'm benefiting a lot from shitty Rails apps now because people come to my company to get refactoring. So thank you, DHH, the inventor of Rails. So what we did so my first idea for Trailblazer was, okay, I don't want my code to be structured by controller and then code for some specific controller, model, code for some specific model. I wanted all the code that belongs together as a domain-specific group in one directory. So that's why we kind of have this like app concepts. Concepts is a new directory we introduced. App concepts, and then, for example, posting. And in that posting directory is all the code and all the layers that are responsible for creating, updating, deleting a blog post. And as you can see, there's already subdirectories, so that's how we structure the layers. Like we have operations, we have view objects, we introduce query objects, and all this kind of stuff. So just by looking at the directory structure, you can already tell, okay, Trailblazer is kind of inverting the structure. We have the concept, the domain concept first, and then the technology. And we are introducing new layers. And so that's the file structure. And what is really interesting is that we kind of had when I say we, I'm mostly talking about myself and my schizophrenic brother. What is really interesting is that I thought, okay, maybe it's a good idea to have business code that is related to creating a blog post in one file and not in one huge model. And so that's, for example, posting, and then we have this concept called operation. I'm going to come to that later. And then create.rb, and in that file, all the logic is sitting to create a blog post. It's actually not just a file, it's a class. And it's so basically, we are finding out use cases, and those use cases are mapped to classes. And that is actually what object-oriented programming is about. And people were going crazy about this. Like, how can you introduce more classes than we already have? This is breaking MVC and all this kind of stuff. It was really crazy. And what they want, or what they were doing is like, again, like fat model. So all the code for everything, for creating, for updating, deleting, is in one class. And then, they had methods like validate form for create, validate form for update, validate form for delete, or something like that. I mean, this is just an example. And just by looking at this, I already know your code architecture is wrong, because you have lots of different use cases in one class. You're handling in one class. And that is basically, object-oriented programming is the opposite. If you have a specific domain use case, move that to a separate object and encapsulate it. But people were really going crazy about this. So now this is a pattern that every framework in Ruby does. You have one class per use case. Back in the days, like I'd say like 10 years ago, people were, I don't know, throwing rocks at me for being the devil who brings more classes into an object-oriented language, which is the whole point about object-oriented programming, is to have those smaller classes. Yeah, anyway. So I was talking a little about like use cases. So what is a use case that we are mapping to those classes? Actually, everything you can trigger as a user in your application, like, I think this is like delete, archive, publish, move to trash. So everything you can click in your application triggers some action in your application, and that what gets triggered is what we call a use case. So every action you take in your application, if that's a banking application or a mailing application or a blog application, everything you can click or submit will need some code that is to process whatever happens. And that's what we call, so it's called like use case. I think it comes from domain-driven design or something. Anyway, so those use cases, in Trailblazer, the idea was, let's handle every use case in a separate class. And the fact that we call those classes operation is just a thing we came up with. But again, like it sounds like super trivial to you, probably because in the frameworks you work in, this is kind of like what people have done for 20 years. In Ruby on Rails, people were going crazy. Like, this is making our code slower because we have additional classes and this kind of shit. Like, it doesn't make sense at all. This is actually making your code faster and easier to maintain. But anyway, so that was kind of what we were fighting with in Ruby on Rails for 10 years. And so the main takeaway for Trailblazer was to introduce places for code, and we call them service object. And the service objects, what they contain is your business code. This is when you ask Midjourney to generate an image for business code. This is what happens. Okay, I told it I want business code and a unicorn, and it came with this image. It's amazing. Like, it's crazy. Look at it. It's so beautiful. If you want it as a tattoo, feel free to download it. So Trailblazer introduced service objects, and the service objects embrace your use cases with your business code. So, for example, when I publish a blog post in my blog application, this will, we had this cycle, this will trigger some logic somewhere. And usually, so in the Rails tutorials, they will tell you, when you click a form, this will be routed to the postings controller and to the create method, and then in that method, you just create a posting and you render a response. It's very simple. But what actually happens is that usually the business code, so this one line is also business code, but usually it looks like this. And that's only like a completely trivial example. So I've seen controller actions with thousands of lines of code that talk to thousands of lines of code in the model, because there is no place in Ruby, in Rails, for business code. So we just don't talk about it. It's like, this can be in the controller, or this can be in the model. So, and when you look at this, code, what is happening? I mean, don't look at the specific details, it doesn't really matter, but there's like authorization happening, then there is like you kind of processing the incoming data to a format that you need, then you do some validation, then you write data to the database, which is like talking to the persistence layer. You probably send out a notification or something, which happens after you saved it successfully. And there's like millions of more steps involved, and it's a lot of logic and a lot of different layers you talk to in this piece of code. And what people also do not see is that there's a lot of control flow. I mean, there's lots of if and else, and if that works, then do that, and if only send a notification if, I don't know, the database write was successful or something like that. So there is a lot of code happening, and we don't have any abstraction in Ruby and in Rails for this kind of code. So people are kind of lost in Rails, and the result is that there's lots of applications that look like this, only worse, and people hire me to make it better, or hire my company. Yeah, so the Rails way of dealing with those kind of problems, the minimal approach was like, hey, let's, I don't know, introduce a call, they call it callbacks, so you could have like steps of code being executed in the controller, and you could have steps of code being executed in the model. So when you save a model, for example, to the database, some code would be run, but then they figured out, hey, I only want to run that code when it's like, yeah, it's super messy. I only want to run this code when I create an object, but I don't want to run that code when I'm updating a model, but I still want to call save. And so they introduced like ifs and else, and it's like super messy. So that because the abstraction layer was just wrong, because still all the code in the controller and in the model. And there was no distinction between different use cases. So that was kind of that is the main problem in Ruby on Rails. And I don't understand why we're still fighting with this. Anyway, so I looked at this, I thought, hey, maybe it's a good idea to move all that code to a certain new component. And just to give you a brief idea where I'm coming from, this is me 500 years ago. And this is when I wrote my first Ruby library. And so that is actually a library called cells. So it's a view layer extension. And I couldn't find the logo anymore because some company made a logo for us, and I lost it, and the internet forgets. So basically what cells does is like it provides view components, so you have like a navigation bar or like a sidebar, and you want to encapsulate that in a component. And so the way it works in Rails is you render a partial, and that is just some template, and that partial can call like weird instance variables, and that can call weird methods, and they are all like global and everything. So you render some fragment. You want to render some fragment, but you're actually rendering it in a global context, and it's like super messy. Where does the data come from? And you have this concept called helpers, so basically methods that are globally available, and you can use them in any view. It's also a problem if you want to have two different versions of Avatar 4. You're basically fucked in Rails. And so on. So, I mean, details do not really matter. So actually, I was really angry with this, and I was super young, as you can tell. And I was asking, hey, how do we fix that? Is there any encapsulation for like view components? And the answer was, no, we don't need that. That's how we do it with partials. And I was super angry because what I wanted was something like, hey, let's render, or let's invoke some object, and that object, into that invocation, I pass all the data the object needs, and the object is completely encapsulated. It doesn't know anything about the outside world. And then this object will give me an HTML fragment. What's the fucking problem with this? And yeah, so we invented like the cells gem, and basically in that object, so you instantiate an object, the object can render HTML, and the template can call instance methods on that object. Again, the details do not matter, but basically what you can see in this beautiful diagram, I mean, I have quite some drawing skills, right? It's crazy. I mean, look at this. What you can see is that the cell was an encapsulated object. It had no access to the outer world, and this is what I wanted, yeah? So you could render a cell in a unit test, for example, and you could check, is the returned HTML fragment looking like this and that? And that was impossible with partials. If you wanted to test a partial, you had to run the entire stack, find the partial in the HTML, and then assert if it shows the right blog post title or something like that. So I wanted something like that, like invoke an object, pass into the object whatever the object needs, like current user, for example. So it's not magically there. You pass it into the object invocation, and then you get back whatever comes back from the object, and that you can unit test. And the inventor of Rails, DHH, he liked this, and I was so pumped. Wow. I was like, I don't know, 23 or something, and the inventor of Ruby on Rails emailed me, like, hey, we like this. I was so pumped. I was really excited. Yeah, it could be a good fit for Rails core. Lots of people, I was blogging a lot back then, and lots of people hated the idea, we don't need that, and you're nuts, you're crazy, why are you introducing .NET into Ruby on Rails? So again, like I was just, I mean, the concept was really simple, encapsulation. It's not rocket science, but people hate this in Ruby on Rails. I don't know what is the problem, but they really were against new layers, new abstractions, and encapsulation. It's much easier if you have like globals and this kind of bullshit. I mean, it drove me crazy. So this is where I'm coming from, and this is what I'm constantly fighting in the Ruby on Rails community, is that people are really conservative and they really don't want to learn new stuff. They really don't want to, I mean, lots of them want, but most people are really anxious of change and of additional abstractions and learning curves. And I mean, for me, this is the whole point of software engineering, is to learn and to apply new patterns or something. But yeah, so that's kind of my problem. And funny enough, then 20 years later, GitHub came up with the view component framework, which is basically a rip-off of cells. They have the exact same naming concepts, the same code. Some code is actually based on stuff we use in cells and so on. And suddenly everyone in Rails loves view components. Oh, encapsulation is awesome. Like, it's so cool to have a component that you can render and it gives you HTML fragment and you can unit test it. That's so cool. But it needs, apparently it needs like Heroku and GitHub and Shopify to show us what is a good engineering approach. Oh God, I'm getting angry here. Let's relax. The beer is only 2 hours away. Okay, so now that you know where I'm coming from, I love encapsulation. I love simplicity. I love when you have no access to the outer world, when you have to pass in variables into an object or into a method in order to provide information. I love those kind of concepts. It's really nothing special. So I basically had this problem with, okay, where do we put the business logic in a controller? And the idea was, okay, the same as we do in a cell, only that we do it in a service object. So you invoke some kind of class, and the class is called posting operation create. So we have namespacing in Ruby. Woo! And so you basically invoke that class. The class has a method called call, and whatever you need in that service object, you have to pass into the method invocation. So it's the exact same idea as we did in the sales gem. And instead of rendering an HTML fragment, the service object will give you back a result object. And the result object, you can ask, were you successful or were you not successful? You can ask a little bit more, but we'll come to that later. But that's basically Trailblazer in a nutshell. Like, move the business logic to a separate class, and wherever you need that business logic, just call or just invoke the operation and work with the result object. So that's the interface for programmers. It's much, much, much more usable and maintainable than the old version. And the cool thing is, you can also unit test service objects. Yeah, you can just invoke them in a unit test, you get back the result object, and then you make sure that everything is the way you want it. Like, there will be database changes, people are sleeping. It was a long night, I know. And you can check side effects, all that in a unit test. Before, when it was sitting in a controller, you had to run the entire HTTP stack to test your business logic, which was, in my opinion, very, very cumbersome. So in the first version of Trailblazer, the problem was that I really just moved all the code, all the business code, into a method called process in that operation class. And you still had the problem that the same kind of messy code was there, but at least it was encapsulated. And once I had those people convinced that new classes mapping to one use case is not slowing down your application, I had the feeling we already made a big step in architecture in Ruby on Rails. The problem was when you wanted to add more code to that business path, what you see here. When you wanted to add something like, for example, check mail quota. It does not make sense at all, but you couldn't come up with anything better. So basically, you had to kind of hack that into the process method. And also, the process method was it was the same mess that we had before. So people started to complain, like, hey, it's actually pretty cool to have this service object implementation, but the way we implement the service, the business logic still sucks. Yeah, and I said, yeah, you're right. So in Trailblazer 2.0, I broke everything. I completely threw away the old APIs. And now you had a DSL, a very simple DSL, to describe the steps your business code is going through. Yeah, you can say like setup params, then you validate, then you can handle errors if there were errors. You can save, then you send email, then you mark a notification send. So basically, you were forced to structure your code in a more maintainable way. Why more maintainable? I'm going to tell you. So with this kind of new implementation, something like adding check mail quota was really nothing more than just adding a new step, and then, of course, implementing that step. We'll come to that in a second. But it was much more maintainable. And there was, what we also have is inheritance in Trailblazer. So you can actually create a new operation, inherit all the steps from create, from the one you see on the left-hand side, and then using our API, you can basically add or remove steps in the subclass. And that is super maintainable. So it's a huge difference to this big if-else block that we had before. And the problem is I started writing a book. This is a beautiful book cover. It's also available as a poster. Come visit me in Berlin and you can have it. The problem was the book was still about the old Trailblazer where you had this one huge big-ass process method. And also writing a book about something you were still changing it was a nightmare. I'm never going to do this again. I'm never going to write a book. I'm never going to write a book about something I work on while I write the book. It was crazy. It sold pretty well in the beginning, and it changed a lot in the perception. So people actually saw Trailblazer as something sustainable because there's a book. I don't know why, but that's psychology apparently. And the problem was it's about the old version, and this is the new version. So again, just to give you some very, very quick details about how we actually implement those steps and why we actually have those steps. So this is how you invoke the business logic, the operation. You invoke call on this operation, and you pass in whatever you need. And you get back this result object, and you can ask the result object, Gesundheit. You can ask the result object, were you successful or were you not successful? And now you're wondering, how does the operation know were you successful or not? That's because we applied a functional concept called railway. So you can see basically the mental model behind this DSL is a 2-track railway, it's called, and you have those steps. And in the happy path, it will just execute all the steps on the success path. And if, for example, the validation fails, it will deviate and skip the remaining steps. And can I get some applause for this animation? Yeah, come on, this is Hollywood. This is Hollywood. I will be working in a CGI studio after this. So that is basically the mental model behind how operations are structured internally. So it takes away the control flow from you. So you don't need if validation failed, call create errors, because that's handled by basically the implementation of the operation. And just real quick, so every step in an operation, there are multiple ways to implement it, but usually it's a method, and if the method returns false, it tells Trailblazer, hey, I failed, deviate. Or you return true, and that means it worked. And then whatever you pass into the invocation of the operation, so that's the public API, how you call that code, you have to pass everything into the invocation from the outside. So there's no access to the outer world. If you want params, for example, in that operation, that's how you would do it. And then you can access those params, you pass into as a keyword argument. I mean, forget about the details, but that's kind of how you deal with data from the outside in a step. And you can also write to an object called context, and then you can use the data you wrote to that context in the following steps. So basically, there's this context object, and it's just passed from step to step to step to step, and you can write to that context object, and in the end, that context object will be the result object that you can ask were you successful or not, and more, but it's just, I don't. So that was, for me, a necessary abstraction. We added a lot of new features in Trailblazer. By the way, I'm the author. So we like desting and tracing. I'm just going to run through that in like 1 minute because it's I don't know. Like, for example, if you figure out, hey, the save step is way too complex, what about adding a separate sub-operation? So like you can actually see it. That was also almost Hollywood. You don't have to give me another standing ovation. So you can use nesting. You just introduce another operation that is a step, okay? And that works with the sub-project macro. So nesting, no problem. What is pretty cool, we also have tracing. So when you run an operation, you can run it using the what the fuck method. what the fuck? Yes, what the fuck? So we can actually use swear words in Ruby, which is pretty cool. And if you call an operation with what the fuck, you can actually see on the terminal the flow of the operation and of the nested operation and so on. And you can actually see if when something failed, you instantly see what step failed, even if it's deeply nested. So that's pretty cool as a tool. And you can do more stuff, like you can have additional flows, and you need that in some cases. Or you can have, there's a bunch of new features. But like what we actually added was tooling on top of that. Actually, I really like that. File is like called file in English. It's so, I don't know, stupid, I don't know. So what we have is what I'm going to try and work on in the coming years is to actually make Trailblazer a sustainable model to where we can make money with it. So it's called Trailblazer Pro, and we have some function for diagrams, and we have a debugger. I know no one needs debuggers because you all write non-Ruby code, so you don't have bugs, right? That's how it works. But what we have is, so when you run an operation with what the fuck, you usually get the trace on the terminal, but you can actually install Trailblazer Pro, and you need some API key and blah, 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 blah. And then it will send this trace to an online debugger, and you can click through the trace. You can inspect the context object at any stage before or after steps. So it's a pretty cool tool on top, and that is light years ahead of what Ruby provides in a debugger, for example, because we have this additional abstraction layer on top. And what is also pretty cool, and I'm super excited about this, is that we are working on some extension where actually you can model, so operations are one use case, creating a block, updating a block, deleting a block, archiving a block, but you can actually create long-running processes with Trailblazer workflow. So that's an example of a moderation workflow for a blog post. Yeah, for example, you can only approve a blog post if you already notified an editor. And Trailblazer will make sure that you can only approve something when you're in the right state. So actually, those diagrams, I mean, you cannot see anything because the resolution or something is fucked, but it's a bit more complicated, but that's kind of what it boils down. So you draw and design complex workflows using the BPMN language from Java, by the way. And you can model really complex workflows using our editor. And every step, every box you see here is implemented as an operation. So you can basically wire together a life cycle of an object with operations. It's pretty cool. And yeah, blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, this is hard to read. So you draw that diagram, you tell Trailblazer where is the operation for the approve step, where is the operation for the publish step, where is the operation for delete. And then Trailblazer will build the state machine for you automatically. There's no magic happening or anything. And there's also no code generated. That's very important. So basically, so Trailblazer takes care of when is something invoked. You don't even, so in current implementations, what you always have to do is like, okay, if I want to delete a blog post, and you can see you can only delete if a blog post was approved. So you always have to ask, hey, am I in the right state? Is my blog posting already approved? Because then I can delete it. And so it completely inverts here. What you do is, I want to delete, and Trailblazer will check for you, are we actually in the correct state to delete that blog post, for example. So again, a lot of control flow is is implemented through Trailblazer. So that's a really exciting project. I'm actually talking about this for, I think, 5 years. And the problem is there's only one little piece is missing to release all that stuff. And that one little thing is like, I don't know, I've been working on that for like 2 years already, and because it's actually not so small. It is small, but whatever. Like if you design frameworks, it's a nightmare because every method name, every argument you pass into a method, you have to think 5 times over it. And so I hope to release that workflow stuff next year. Anyway, so what I was trying to point out in this absolutely boring and demanding talk, I mean, the sun is still shining outside, you could be there, thank you for staying, is that we have a problem in Ruby and in Ruby on Rails with structuring code, and that's kind of what we address by introducing new abstractions, new higher level things. Now we're talking about like operations, for example, instead of, oh, there's this snippet of code, and that's handling the update in the model. Like, go there. Now you can say, like, hey, go to the update operation and check out how we update a blog post. So that's a higher level abstraction, and it kind of makes work for a lot of people easier, because we also introduced this tooling, like tracing, for example. You have no idea when you have a massive application with massive operations, a lot of nesting, because there is a lot of code to handle. People use tracing every day. They tell us every week. There's an email, not every week, but like, hey man, we love this tracing. Thank you so much, because we finally start understanding our code. So the tooling we provide is kind of, I mean, it helps me, so it helps other people. And what's the most interesting part about Trailblazer is, I mean, this is not like this success story. We're not like industry standard and, you know, making millions of euros or dollars every month or something. We could, but we're not making it. But what we actually really changed is that in some companies, the attitude in coding, the way they have their teams work on code is changed, because we provide them new abstractions. As I said, now they're talking about like operations, for example, and it was like shifting the mindset a lot in a lot of Ruby companies that are using Trailblazer. We don't have like millions of users, but we have thousands of commercial projects. And it's really interesting to talk to. So I do consulting all the time, and I hear stories, and it's really interesting to see how you know, now you're talking about use cases, and now you're talking about operations. So it's kind of like, oh, did you read the DDD book when you implemented Trailblazer? It's like, no, it's just like encapsulation. But it's really interesting how it changes how people work in big teams, for example. So the problem is still I have shit tons of libraries. I have a few people who help me, but they are always gone. You know, one is pregnant, the other one wants to go on a sabbatical, the other one is depressed for a couple of months. So if you're interested, if you want to do Ruby, we are really cool people. We are good drinkers. Some of us are hipsters. And you can help me with Trailblazer. One of those windows can be yours if you want. And I deleted Twitter because fuck Elon Musk. But I'm on Ruby Social Mastodon, which is like, there's like 5 people. It's amazing. You can always add me if you want. Or ping me on LinkedIn. By the way, I'm here till Sunday. So whoever wants to go have a beer with me tomorrow, or coffee or whatever, I'm here till Sunday. Ping me on LinkedIn or something. And thank you for your attention. It was a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you for the talk. And surprisingly, we do have questions.
Huh?
I know. He promised there will be none.
No, normally there's this, you know, when I ask, is there a question, and the people have this avalanche of bullshit rolling over them, and they're like...
Okay, so the first question. Have you heard of the idea of solving encapsulation in Ruby by creating many smaller models? If yes, what do you think about it?
Many smaller models, well, I think it's just a naming problem. Models usually refer to a database connection. Model usually in Ruby means, or in Rails, that you're talking through a model to a database table. So basically, if the person who asked that means, what if you solve encapsulation by introducing more objects? I love that. That's kind of what we do. You don't need Trailblazer. You can do everything Trailblazer does with more objects. So I think I think it's only a naming problem. But yes, encapsulation is always just introducing objects. Great person, you're hired.
The next one is, PHP is probably most hated language ever. I don't think it's nice, but I can see Ruby is much worse. Sorry for off topic. Hey, no kink shaming here.
What was the original, the first language?
PHP.
PHP. I disagree. Check out the Ruby is Dead talk. I show some features of PHP 7, and it's actually pretty cool. I mean, it looks like shit, but it's the way they work on higher level abstractions, like something like Trailblazer, is amazing. So PHP has this horrible like reputation, but actually, I like it better than Ruby. Yeah, I mean, yeah, but that's what the person was saying.
Yeah. So you
what
agree?
What am I doing here?
So. The next one is actually a question. So, have you met more developers who like or dislike your idea of encapsulation?
50-50.
Okay. And
it's also because it's sampling bias, because I meet more people who like me than I meet people who don't like me, because people who don't like me just don't hang out with me. By the way, I have stickers. If you want to hang out with me.
Okay, the last comment here is not a question, but I am both horrified and impressed by where it started and where it's going.
Thank you. Brilliant comment to end this talk. Thanks again.
So thank you once again, thank you, and we will continue in 9 minutes with the last talk of the day.